At just 12 years old, he sat in that courtroom with a smile that made everyone's skin crawl. While other kids his age worried about homework and video games, this boy had been living out twisted fantasies that would haunt investigators for years. He genuinely believed he was too young to face real consequences, that his age would be his get-out-of-jail-free card. What he didn't know was that one perfect fingerprint had already sealed his fate. That tiny piece of evidence would be enough to convince a judge that some monsters come in small packages, and this one needed to be locked away before he could hurt anyone else. How does a child become a monster? And how does that monster learn to hide behind the innocent face of a 12-year-old boy? This was the question that would haunt a city. A question born from an act of violence so depraved it seemed to defy all logic and human understanding. The crime was not a product of youthful anger or a fleeting moment of bad judgment. It was the calculated and sadistic work of a predator who had been honing his dark desires in secret for years. The victim, a kind young man with a bright future, was not chosen for any reason other than his availability. A random target selected to satisfy an unspeakable hunger for power and control. The city of Miami, Florida, a place of vibrant, sun-drenched days and neon-soaked nights, has always harbored a shadowy underbelly of crime and corruption beneath its glittering facade. It is a city of extremes where immense wealth and desperate poverty coexist, creating a landscape where the unthinkable can and often does happen. But even for a city accustomed to violence, the murder of Christopher Davis was something different, something that felt like a tear in the very fabric of the community. The crime scene, a quiet apartment in a working-class neighborhood, became the epicenter of a story that would expose a level of evil few could have imagined possible in a child. Christopher Davis was 24 years old, a recent graduate who worked 2 jobs to support his ailing mother, a young man known for his gentle spirit and his unwavering optimism. He was the kind of person who saw the good in everyone, a quality that would, in the end, make him fatally vulnerable to the predator who crossed his path. Christopher had no enemies, no dark secrets, no connection to the city's criminal underworld. He was simply a good person in the wrong place at the very worst time. His death was a senseless and brutal eraser of a life that was just beginning, a life full of promise and potential. The perpetrator was David Harvey, a 12-year-old boy from a seemingly normal suburban family, a child who on the surface was utterly unremarkable. He was quiet, a decent student, a boy who spent his afternoons playing video games and riding his bike through the manicured streets of his neighborhood. But beneath this veneer of childhood innocence, a monstrous ideology was taking root, a belief that he was superior to others, that he had the right to exert ultimate control over another human being. The abduction and murder of Christopher Davis was not an impulse. It was the culmination of months of planning and years of fantasizing, the first horrifying step in what he imagined would be a long and celebrated career as a killer. The details of the crime were as meticulous as they were horrifying, revealing a level of premeditation that was staggering in a 12-year-old. David had stalked his victim for days, learning his routine, mapping his movements, and choosing the perfect moment to strike. He had used a ruse, a feigned cry for help, to lure Christopher into a secluded area, exploiting his victim's kindness and compassion as a weapon against him. The act itself was one of pure sadism, a prolonged and brutal assault designed to maximize Christopher's terror and to give David the ultimate thrill of holding another person's life in his hands. Investigators arriving at the scene were confronted with a level of brutality that would stay with them for the rest of their careers. The evidence spoke not of a struggle, but of a systematic and controlled torture, the work of a killer who was not just taking a life, but savoring the process. It was clear that the motive was not robbery or revenge, but something far more sinister: the simple, unadulterated pleasure of inflicting pain and asserting absolute dominance. This was a trophy killing in its purest form, an act committed solely for the perpetrator's own twisted gratification. The initial investigation was a confusing and frustrating search for a ghost, a killer with no apparent motive and no connection to the victim. The detectives of the Miami-Dade Police Department worked tirelessly chasing down leads that went nowhere, interviewing friends and family who could offer no insight into why anyone would want to harm a person as universally loved as Christopher. The city held its breath, gripped by the fear of a random, unseen killer who could strike anyone at any time. a monster who had emerged from the city's shadowy underbelly to commit an act of incomprehensible evil. The community's reaction was one of profound shock and grief, a city united in its sorrow for a young man who represented the very best of Miami. Vigils were held and memorials grew on the street where Christopher had last been seen, a testament to the deep and personal impact of his death. In a city often divided by culture and class, the murder of Christopher Davis became a unifying tragedy, a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the ever-present potential for darkness to encroach on the sun-drenched streets of paradise. The psychological profile of the killer was a chilling portrait of a narcissistic and sadistic personality, someone who would feel no remorse and would likely relish the attention his crime was receiving. The police knew they were not hunting for a common criminal. They were hunting for a predator of the highest order, someone who saw other people, not as human beings, but as objects to be used and discarded for their own amusement. They had no idea that the monster they were looking for was a 12-year-old boy, a child who was at that very moment watching the news reports of his own crime with a sense of pride and accomplishment. The full weight of the tragedy settled upon the city as days turned into weeks with no arrest. The vibrant, carefree atmosphere of Miami was replaced by a palpable sense of unease, a community looking over its shoulder, wondering where the monster would strike next. The murder had exposed the dark side of the city's paradise, the hidden corruption that could allow such an evil to fester in plain sight. Little did they know that the evil was not hiding in the shadows of a back alley, but in a child's bedroom in a quiet suburban home, a place where a 12-year-old boy was dreaming of his next kill. The breakthrough in the case came from a single overlooked piece of evidence, a clear fingerprint lifted from a discarded soda bottle found near the abduction site. For weeks, it had sat in a database unmatched to any known criminals, a silent and frustrating dead end. But a routine cross-check with other databases, including those for juvenile offenders, yielded a stunning and unbelievable hit. The fingerprint belonged to David Harvey, a 12-year-old boy with no criminal record, a child who had never even been in trouble at school. The arrest of a child for such a monstrous crime sent a shockwave through the Miami-Dade Police Department and the entire city. Detectives, hardened by years of dealing with the worst of humanity, struggled to comprehend the possibility that a boy who had not yet reached puberty could be capable of such calculated sadism. They approached his family's home with a sense of dread and disbelief, their minds racing to find some other explanation, some mistake in the system. But the science was irrefutable. The fingerprint was a perfect match. When Detective Mark Johnson and his partner arrived at the Harveys' suburban home, they were greeted by a scene of perfect domesticity. The lawn was neatly manicured, a bicycle lay on its side in the driveway, and through the window they could see David sitting on the couch playing a video game. As they laid him away, his parents were a picture of confusion and outrage, screaming about police harassment and a terrible mistake. David, however, remained unnervingly calm, his expression one of mild curiosity, as if this were all just an interesting and unexpected diversion from his afternoon. In the sterile, windowless interrogation room, the boy's composure did not break. It hardened into an icy and arrogant confidence. Seated across from Detective Johnson, a man with 2 decades of experience in getting criminals to talk, David seemed not intimidated, but amused. He was not a scared child and over his head. He was a predator in his element, a performer who had finally been given the stage he had always craved. The confession, when it came, was not a tearful admission of guilt, but a boastful and detailed recitation of his crime. He confessed with relish, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips as he recounted the most gruesome and sadistic details of Christopher Davis's final moments. He spoke with the calm, analytical detachment of a scientist, describing an experiment, providing information that only the killer could know. He corrected the detectives on minor details of the crime scene, his memory perfect, his pride in his work evident in every word. He was not just confessing, he was performing, turning the interrogation into a showcase for his own perceived brilliance and cruelty. The most chilling aspect of his confession was his complete and total lack of remorse. He spoke of his victim not as a person, but as a thing, an object he had used to achieve a desired sensation. He described Christopher's pleas for his life with a theatrical sigh of boredom, as if they were a minor annoyance in an otherwise perfect experience. Detective Johnson, a man who had stared into the eyes of countless killers, found himself looking at something he had never seen before. A complete and total void, an absence of humanity so profound it was almost supernatural. David's confession was a guided tour of a deeply disturbed mind, a world in which empathy did not exist, and other people were merely tools for his gratification. He provided details that were not necessary for a conviction, details he shared for the sole purpose of traumatizing the officers in the room. He described the sounds, the smells, and the textures of his crime. With a poet's attention to detail, each word a carefully chosen instrument of psychological torture. He was not just admitting to a murder. He was forcing his audience to experience it with him. He seemed to enjoy the shock and disgust on the faces of the detectives, feeding off their horror as if it were a source of nourishment. He was in complete control, and he knew it. He answered their questions with an intellectual arrogance, treating them as inferiors who were struggling to keep up with his superior mind. This was not a confession driven by guilt or a desire for redemption. It was a confession driven by ego, the act of a monster who was so proud of his creation that he could not resist the urge to share it with the world. The legal and psychological ramifications of a 12-year-old confessing to such a crime were staggering. A team of psychiatrists was brought in to evaluate him, and their report painted a portrait of a classic psychopath, a child born without a conscience who possessed an adult's capacity for manipulation and violence. He had fooled everyone, his parents, his teachers, his friends, with a carefully constructed mask of normality. A performance so perfect that no one had ever seen the monster lurking beneath. The vibrant, sun-drenched city of Miami was now forced to confront the terrifying reality that one of its most dangerous predators was a 12-year-old boy. As they led David to a juvenile detention center, his smug confidence remained unshaken. He had given them his story, his masterpiece, and he was convinced that his age would be his ultimate shield, that the system would not know what to do with him, that he would be treated as a troubled child rather than the cold-blooded killer he was. He was a detail-oriented sadist who had planned every aspect of his crime. But he had made one critical miscalculation. He had underestimated the revulsion of a society that, when confronted with pure evil, would find a way to create a cage strong enough to hold it, no matter how small the monster might be. With a chilling confession secured, the work of building an airtight case against a 12-year-old murderer began, a task that was as legally complex as it was emotionally draining. Prosecutor Laura Bailey and her team knew that the defense would try to have the confession thrown out, arguing that a child could not have knowingly waived his rights. They needed to build a case so strong that it could stand on its own, a mountain of evidence that would prove David Harvey's guilt beyond any shadow of a doubt, regardless of his own boastful words. The investigation took a dark and heartbreaking turn when detectives began to dig into David's past. And what they discovered was a pattern of escalating cruelty that had been ignored or dismissed at every turn. They found evidence that David had a long and hidden history of torturing and killing neighborhood animals. Acts of sadism that were a classic precursor to violence against humans. Neighbors recounted stories of missing pets, of finding small animals mutilated in the woods behind their homes, incidents they had chalked up to wild predators, never imagining the predator was the quiet boy who lived down the street. The most damning discovery, however, was a series of ignored pleas from David's own younger sister. She had repeatedly told her parents and a school counselor that her brother scared her, that he had a bad place in his eyes, and that he had threatened her with violence if she ever told anyone about the things he did to animals. Her cries for help were dismissed as childish sibling rivalry, her fears seen as an overactive imagination. The system, both at home and at school, had failed her, just as it had failed to see the monster it was helping to create. This history of ignored warnings became a central pillar of the prosecution's case. Laura Bailey argued that this was not a sudden, inexplicable act of violence, but the predictable outcome of a pattern of systemic failures. The parents, blinded by denial, had refused to see the darkness growing in their own son. The school, overburdened and underfunded, had failed to recognize the classic warning signs of a budding psychopath. The entire community, in its desire to maintain the illusion of suburban tranquility, had looked the other way. The case highlighted a devastating pattern of systemic failures. where the adults who were supposed to protect children had instead enabled a predator. The school counselor who had dismissed the sisters' fears was forced to testify, her shame and regret palpable, on the witness stand. She admitted that she had not taken the claim seriously, that she had seen David as a quiet, if slightly withdrawn child, not a potential killer. Her testimony was a heartbreaking indictment of a system that was not equipped to identify or deal with a child who was truly evil. The parents' denial was even more profound. In interview after interview, they insisted that their son was a good boy, that he was being framed, that the police had coerced a false confession from a scared and confused child. They hired a team of high-priced lawyers who immediately began a public relations campaign to paint David as the victim, a troubled youth who was being railroaded by an overzealous legal system. Their refusal to accept the truth, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, was a stunning display of willful blindness. The vibrant, sun-drenched city of Miami, which had been so quick to judge and condemn, was now forced to look at its own complicity. The story of David Harvey was not just the story of a single monster, but the story of a community that had failed to protect its most vulnerable. The shadowy underbelly of the city was not just about crime and corruption. It was also about the quiet, suburban darkness of denial and neglect. A darkness that could be just as deadly. The prosecution team meticulously pieced together the timeline of David's escalating cruelty, creating a narrative that was both horrifying and undeniable. They presented the testimony of child psychologists who explained that for a psychopath like David, the pleasure derived from torturing animals was a rehearsal for the ultimate thrill of killing a human. He was a predator in training, and his family and community had been his unwitting enablers, providing him with the time and the privacy he needed to perfect his craft. This evidence of a long history of cruelty was crucial in countering the defense's narrative of a child who had made a single terrible mistake. Laura Bailey was able to show the jury that David was not a child in the traditional sense. He was a monster in a child's body, a predator with a lifetime of experience in violence and manipulation. The heartbreaking pleas of his sister, ignored and dismissed, became the voice of every person David had ever harmed, a haunting echo of a tragedy that could have and should have been prevented. The case of David Harvey was a wake-up call for the city of Miami, a horrifying lesson in the consequences of ignoring the warning signs of childhood psychopathy. The systemic failures that had allowed him to kill were now laid bare for all to see, a shameful and public record of a community's failure. The trial was no longer just about seeking justice for Christopher Davis. It was about holding a mirror up to a society that had allowed one of its own children to become a monster who had been hiding in plain sight all along. In the months leading up to his trial, David Harvey's behavior in juvenile detention only served to reinforce the prosecution's portrait of a remorseless and narcissistic predator. He showed no signs of guilt or sadness, no indication that he understood the gravity of his actions. Instead, he treated his incarceration as a minor inconvenience, an annoying interruption to his life, and his primary focus was not on his crime, but on the perceived injustices of his confinement. The most stunning and infuriating display of his narcissistic priorities came when he filed a formal motion with the court, a handwritten complaint that was as audacious as it was insulting to the memory of his victim. He was not complaining about his lack of freedom or the prospect of a lifetime behind bars. He was complaining about the quality of the food. In a carefully worded, almost legalistic document, he detailed his grievances with the detention sense menu, arguing that the bland and unappetizing meals were a violation of his basic human rights. This complaint about jail food became a symbol of his profound detachment from reality. While the family of Christopher Davis was planning a funeral, David Harvey was drafting a legal argument about the sogginess of his tater tots. It was a stunning window into the mind of a psychopath, a complete inability to comprehend the suffering of others, a world in which his own minor discomforts were more important than the life he had so brutally taken. The motion was, of course, immediately dismissed by a disgusted judge, but the damage was done. News of the complaint spread quickly through the city, fueling the public's outrage and solidifying the image of David as a soulless monster. The vibrant, sun-drenched city of Miami, with its culture of excess and indulgence, was now confronted with a form of self-centeredness so extreme it was almost a caricature. The story became a dark and bitter joke, a symbol of a generation of children who had been raised with a sense of entitlement so profound that even a murderer could complain about the menu. For prosecutor Laura Bailey, the motion was a gift. She planned to introduce it at trial as evidence of his character, a clear and undeniable demonstration of his lack of remorse. It was a piece of paper that spoke more eloquently about his state of mind than any psychological evaluation ever could. It was proof that he was not a scared child who had made a mistake, but a cold and calculating predator who was utterly devoid of empathy. In the pre-trial hearings, David's demeanor was one of bored indifference. He would often yawn theatrically, roll his eyes at the prosecutor's statements, and doodle on a legal pad, paying no attention to the proceedings that would determine the course of his entire life. His lawyers, a high-priced team hired by his still-in-denial parents, were visibly frustrated by his behavior, their attempts to coach him on courtroom decorum proving utterly useless. He was convinced that he was the smartest person in the room, and he treated the entire legal process with open contempt. His parents continued their campaign to paint him as the victim, giving tearful interviews to any television station that would have them. They spoke of their sweet, sensitive boy, a child who loved animals and was kind to his sister, a portrait so at odds with reality that it was almost laughable. They were living in a fantasy world, a bubble of denial so thick that no amount of evidence could penetrate it. Their public performance of grief was as hollow and unconvincing as their son's. The contrast between David's trivial complaints and the profound suffering of the Davis family was a stark and powerful narrative that would define the trial. On one side was a family destroyed by a senseless act of violence, a family that would never again share a holiday or a birthday with their beloved son. On the other was a 12-year-old killer who was more concerned with the quality of his dessert than the life he had extinguished. It was a moral chasm so wide that it left no room for sympathy or understanding. The complaint about the food was more than just an act of arrogance. It was a form of psychological warfare. David knew that it would be leaked to the press, and he knew that it would cause pain to the victim's family. It was a way for him to continue to exert control, to remind the world that even behind bars, he was still the one pulling the strings. It was a final sickening taunt from a monster who derived pleasure from the suffering of others. As the trial date approached, the city of Miami braced itself for a legal spectacle unlike any it had ever seen. The case was no longer just about a murder. It was about the nature of evil itself, about the question of whether a child could truly be born without a soul. The complaint about jail food, a seemingly minor and absurd detail, had become a key piece of evidence, a symbol of the defendant's monstrous narcissism, a final and unforgivable insult to the memory of Christopher Davis. The trial of David Harvey began on a sweltering Miami morning, the air thick with humidity and a sense of grim anticipation. The courthouse was a media circus with satellite trucks lining the street and reporters from around the world jockeying for position. Inside, the courtroom was packed. A somber and silent audience gathered to witness the final act in a tragedy that had captivated and horrified the nation. As David was led to the defendant's table, a murmur rippled through the gallery. He was so small, so ordinary-looking, a-killed in a suit that was slightly too big for him, a stark and unsettling contrast to the monstrousness of his crime. Prosecutor Laura Bailey began her opening statement with a power and a fury that immediately seized the jury's attention. She painted a vivid and damning picture of the defendant not as a child, but as a predator who had been hiding in plain sight. She walked them through the evidence, the fingerprint, the confession, the history of animal cruelty. Each fact another brick in the wall of guilt she was building around him. Through it all, David watched her with a look of detached amusement, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk on his face. The first day of testimony was a brutal and emotionally draining experience for everyone in the courtroom. The first responders described the horror of the crime scene, their voices cracking with an emotion they had been trained to suppress. Christopher Davis's mother took the stand, her body frail and trembling as she spoke of her kind and gentle son, her testimony, a gut-wrenching portrait of a parent's unending grief. Jurors wept openly, and even the stoic judge, Arthur Hughes, seemed to be struggling to maintain his composure. But it was on the second day of the trial that David Harvey chose to reveal the true depth of his depravity. He arrived in court wearing a simple, nondescript blue button-down shirt, an item of clothing so ordinary that it initially went unnoticed. But as Christopher Davis's father, Robert, took the stand to testify, he suddenly stopped mid-sentence, his face paling, his eyes fixed on the defendant. A gasp of pure horror rippled through the courtroom as everyone followed his gaze and realized the sickening truth. The blue shirt that David was wearing belonged to Christopher. It was a shirt Robert Davis had bought for his son's 24th birthday, a shirt Christopher had been wearing in the last photograph ever taken of him. David had somehow smuggled it out of the evidence locker or had taken it from the crime scene, a sickening trophy that he'd saved for this very moment. It was a silent, unspeakable taunt, a gesture of contempt so profound and so cruel it left the entire courtroom breathless with shock. The chaos that erupted was immediate and absolute. Robert Davis let out a cry of pure animalistic rage and tried to lunge at the defendant's table held back by two baifs. The jury stared at David in open-mouthed horror, their faces masks of revulsion and disbelief. Laura Bailey, for the first time in her career, was speechless, her mind struggling to process the level of calculated evil she was witnessing. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated monstrosity, a glimpse into a soul that was not just broken, but entirely absent. Judge Hughes, his face a thunderous mask of fury, slammed his gavel down, his voice booming through the courtroom as he ordered the jury to be removed. He then turned his wrath on David's defense attorneys, demanding to know how such a thing could have happened, his words dripping with a contempt that was usually reserved for the criminals he sentenced. The attorneys, caught completely off guard, could only stammer that they had no knowledge of where the shirt had come from, their own faces etched with a mixture of shock and professional horror. The incident was a catastrophic and unreoverable blow to the defense. Any slim hope they had of painting David as a troubled and remorseful child was obliterated in that single monstrous gesture. He had not just admitted his guilt, he had reveled in it, using the victim's own clothing as a weapon to torture his grieving family in a public forum. It was an act of psychological warfare so sadistic it was almost impossible to comprehend. When the trial resumed, the atmosphere was forever changed. The jury no longer saw a 12-year-old boy at the defendant's table, they saw a monster. His age, which had once been the most shocking aspect of the case, was now irrelevant. He had shown them the blackness of his heart, and it was a sight they would never forget. He had wanted to show them that he was still in control, that he was the master of this theater of cruelty. But in his arrogance, he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had not intimidated them. He had solidified their resolve. He had not shown them his power. He had shown them his weakness, the pathetic and desperate need of a narcissist to be the center of attention. The trial would continue, but the verdict was already written on the horrified faces of the 12 men and women who now understood that they were not just judging a crime, but looking into the face of pure, unadulterated evil. With the jury already convinced of David Harvey's monstrosity, prosecutor Laura Bailey's case transitioned from proving guilt to illuminating the depths of his depravity. She began to present the physical evidence, a meticulous and soul-crushing parade of exhibits that documented the final terrifying moments of Christopher Davis's life. The courtroom, already tense, fell into a heavy and oppressive silence as the reality of the crime was laid bare in the most tangible way imaginable, transforming abstract horror into concrete, undeniable fact. The prosecution team had spent months combing through every inch of David's life, and their search had yielded a treasure trove of darkness. They presented the jury with his school notebooks filled not with homework, but with violent and graphic drawings, detailed fantasies of torture and murder. They showed them his computer search history, a horrifying chronicle of a young mind obsessed with serial killers, decomposition rates, and methods of evading law enforcement. Each piece of evidence was a window into a secret world of sadism that he had carefully cultivated behind the closed door of his bedroom. The emotional climax of the prosecution's case came when a large, sealed evidence box was brought into the courtroom. Detective Mark Johnson took the stand, his face grim as he opened the box and began.